born on the 18th of February 1932, and Hitler took power early 1933. And that was bad news for Jews. Even early on, there was a kind of sense of danger around us, which only increased. Anti-Semitism was awakened. I think it was buried deep in the culture already, but it was nurtured and brought out. There was the articles in the newspaper. There were the cartoons showing how evil the Jews were. The population was being influenced first by words, and then the actions came. It was the first movie showing of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was the first time that I was going to go to the cinema, and obviously I was very excited, and there was another girl taking me. I was maybe 7, and she was 10 years older. And we walked to the cinema, and as we approached, of course, my anticipation grew, but then I looked at her face, and she looked startled and afraid. And then she read out the notice outside the cinema, "No Jews allowed." And we couldn't go. The Kristallnacht was the time it became openly violent. My parents, very late, realized what was going on. The reality became real to them that there was the possibility of death. My father had access to a rescue effort for children. The rescue effort's name is Kindertransport. And my father found a place for me on the train, and I left Germany just weeks before World War II started. 10,000 children were rescued by the Kindertransport. Contrasting with that, 1.5 million Jewish children perished. Young people today bear heavy burdens, many challenges, but my story is a story of hope, and I want to give you hope. My greatest memory of life as a small child, even from very early on, was incredible love. We were Jewish, and I think that it's something about the Jewish culture that you are very expressive. And so I felt the warmth, the closeness, the touching, the affirmation. Many of the stores in the main street were owned by Jews. My father had several businesses. One was a household store with quite on the main street with 2 large display windows. The law was passed that Jewish businesses had to be sold at a very low price to Gentiles. And I was standing very close to my father, and we looked down the stairs, and the new owner of his business was a Gentile. He was a German. And I looked down and I saw his face, and this man's face was angry, and out of his mouth flew words that were so filled of hatred. It was like bullets hitting us. And I looked at my father, and he was silent. I can remember thinking, why doesn't he say something? Why doesn't he do something? Why doesn't he protect us? My father is silent. And I thought for a long time that my father was a weak man. And now, when I look back, I realize how utterly strong he was. To remain silent was to protect us. If he had resisted, things would have been much worse. So that was a very personal example, but all over Germany, and even in places that Germany ruled, like Austria, Jews were experiencing the beginnings of persecution. There were gradual things, like at school. I began school, and it was the local Lutheran school. And we used to have arithmetic books that counted colourful balls, spinning tops, and it made the subject somewhat interesting. But then suddenly one day, our books changed. And instead of counting and adding and subtracting balls and tops, we were counting tanks and guns and helmets and marching soldiers. And looking back, I can see how the whole nation was being indoctrinated with militant ideas. My father's store was on the main street and we lived above it. So we had a front row seat when Hitler came to town. There was built a castle. Hitler had the intention of building castles to replace medieval castles, to represent the wonder and the power of the Third Reich, which he said would last 1,000 years. 6 kilometers above our little town, Hitler's castle, Vogelsang, was built, and he came for the opening. This castle, the purpose of it was to train German officers in racial philosophy. And many of the graduates from that college went to the east, and some of them were commanders of the concentration camps. It was a big event locally, and Hitler came to the opening of the castle. He arrived at the little train station in Gmünd and got into an open car, and he traversed from the train station through the center of our town up the hill 6 kilometers to the castle. And we were in our apartment. My parents, I remember, were sitting against the back wall, pressed against the back wall on the sofa. I was a very precocious child, and I was pressed with my nose to the window. And I saw the local crowds. I saw young women in dirndl dresses with long blonde plaits, throwing flowers in the air. It was a procession. And I saw the population on the sidewalk with their arms up, Heil Hitler. And then the car came through, and he was in the back. I think about the effect on our town. I think we are very affected by leaders, the role of leaders in indoctrination of the population. It was a gradual thing, and I think this is a huge warning about the speech and the despising the other, holding other people in contempt. It was a gradual, step-by-step process. So first, there was the indoctrination, there was the media, there were the films, there was the music, there was the speeches, there were the spectacular events showing the power of the National Socialism and the Aryan myth, the superiority. Many Jews, including my father, they said to each other, "This is crazy. This can't continue. Surely Hitler and those who are his henchmen, this can't last." And you know, Germany had always been very proud of their culture, their history, their intelligence. They had these intellectuals and the arts. How could a people with this kind of culture deteriorate to the depths of inhumanity? So I think my parents, like the many other Jews, felt this couldn't endure. This is not possible. But it did endure. It got worse and worse. And I actually remember lying in bed and hearing an argument between my parents. My mother, very full of anxiety and passion, saying she can't go, and my father insisting I have to go. And you know, because my father prevailed, I'm here telling this story. You know, I think about how convinced my father was that this was the only way out, because they could no longer find a place outside Germany. It was too late. Like many Jews, they came to the realization that they wanted to leave, but actually there were no countries that would take them. That's a very sobering thing when we think about refugees. The fact that they could find no place to go. I believe my father had access to a rescue effort for children. The rescue effort's name is Kindertransport. And my father found a place for me on the train, and I left Germany just weeks before World War II started. You know, 10,000 children were rescued by the Kindertransport. Contrasting with that, 1.5 million Jewish children perished. But when I look back, I think about how it must have been for my parents to make such a decision. I've described how I was the only child of elderly parents, and they're a kind of focus of love. I mean, what did it take for a parent to give their child away, not knowing what would happen the other end? I think I didn't realize all that was happening. And my mother put a label around my neck. That was my identification. And there was a number on that round label. The number was 8814. And when I think that it was 10,000 children that were rescued, I realized that I'm actually quite late in the list. And indeed, it was shortly before all freedom possibilities closed. I remember we had a lift. That was a real big deal to have a lift in your home. And I remember going down in the lift with my parents and stepping out of the front door And the next memory I have is being at Köln Hauptbahnhof, Cologne main train station. And the platform was very crowded with people. My parents helped me up the steps. At that time, the trains were steam trains and there were very big steps. I was a small child and they had to help me up the steep steps. And I remember turning around and looking at them. My parents had told me I was going on a nice trip. I think they told me that in order to get me to go, because if they had given any inkling of their own despair and agony about it, I would have made a big scene. It would have been very difficult. So they wanted to ease the way. So I was kind of really okay with everything. But then I looked round and I saw their eyes and they were crying. And that was the moment that I realized this is not a nice trip. And then the next memory is sitting inside the train, crunched in a corner. And of course, the other children had differing reactions. And they were running up and down, very excited. There were hardly any adults around. I think there were just a few Red Cross workers. And I remember somebody saying, "Can't you behave like this nice little girl sitting there?" But I actually wasn't behaving. I was deep in despair. And it was the moment of trauma that would affect me for many years. I shut down emotionally. How does a child of 7 deal with the loss of every bit of security? So my method was to just put a lid on it. It was shortly after that the war was declared. And so around me in England was great anxiety because, in England, there was great fear that Germany would invade and that they were not ready for that. Germany had already defeated all those European countries. So how could England, this little island, be safe? So here I was, surrounded by people who had somewhat anxious minds. I was aware that I was a foreigner. I was a German. And so what I did, I tried to fit in. I tried to conform to how other people behaved. I tried to become a nice little English girl and do the English things. So on the outside, I conformed and I tried to talk in the same way and act in the same way. But inside, I was Jewish, but I was also full of anger and hatred that churned within me. I carried a lot of anger towards Germany and Germans because I realized that what had happened in Germany contributed to my losses. But also, when I look back, I think about what kind of things were in the newspapers, what was on the radio in England. Germany was the enemy, so they were described in very dark ways. And so here I was, it was like a split person, but it fed my own attitude towards Germany, what had happened to me. But added to that is a very almost like shameful thing that I tell. I felt my parents had abandoned me. Now that was my child understanding. I felt they had just let me go. And, you question love. Did they love me? Why did they let me go? And it's only now, and the years after this, that I realize the kind of love they displayed was self-sacrificial love. It was really very pure. I became a teacher in a small town in southern England, and gradually my capacity to contain the turbulence that was inside became more than I could cope with. I think for so many years I had been operating in denial and suppression, attempting to fit in, to conform. I had increasingly realized how sad I was inside, and it became almost unbearable. And it was at that time I was teaching. I was loving the environment. You know, we were in a country area and it was so peaceful and there was so much beauty around. And I was with a class of children who were actually eager to learn. It was a country school, and I enjoyed what we did together. But inside, I wondered, is this good enough? Am I really able to do this? I had a lot of self-doubt, but on top of that, my anger and rage became a burden too much for me. It was like I was at the end of my rope. And it so happened that at that exact moment that I heard for the first time that I could give that to my Heavenly Father. And I did it. You know, I did it because I had no other way out. And this was like a door opened. It was a rescue effort of my soul. And, you know, that was the beginning when I really started to live. Now, what do I do with the memories of what was done to me? What do I do about my feelings about my parents? In my mind, in my heart, I started to revisit what had happened. And having the anger and bitterness lifted from me, mentally I began to focus on those who had wronged me, in reality or in my perception. But you know, it's one thing to kind of mentally say, I forgive you, when you're thousands of miles away from what happened. For me, the big difference came in going back to Germany. I returned to Germany. I went there with my husband, and we went to the places in the town where I had sad memories, like the cinema or the street where Hitler had traversed. And gradually I began to meet people who had known my parents and known me as a baby. What do I do as a child of Holocaust victims? I went on the journey, and I had 8 friends and my husband who accompanied me. And the 10 of us traveled where my parents traveled. And we stopped at the incinerator at their very end, where they were burnt. Knowing can be very painful, and I was a bit afraid of what I would find out. But I'd come to the place where I needed to know. And we made an appointment, and we sat in this room. It was full of papers and books. And this very lovely German woman, I would say she was probably about in her late 50s, very gracious. She searched in the computer. I gave as much information as I could, and out comes the paper. And then she looked at me and she said, "I'm very, very sorry to tell you this, but your parents were deported to the Lodz ghetto. They spent about a year there, and then they were gassed in Chelmno. And Chelmno is a very small place in Poland that was dedicated to death. It was not a work camp. And the method of killing was asphyxiation by the exhaust from a truck. The Jews were pushed into a truck, and the exhaust the pipe had been changed to go inside the truck. And as the truck was driven to the forest, to a prepared place, they gradually died. And when they reached the forest, there was this large pit where the bodies were burned, and she gave me the date and the details. And so I felt her compassion. The words forgiveness, repentance, reconciliation all revolve around a core issue: justice. I think without justice, forgiveness you can almost say it's a mockery. I think even little children have a sense of justice. They say that's not fair. And, justice. Is there justice? We have to have justice. We desire justice. There isn't an ease without it. But when we look at the world around us, I think there's a great famine of justice. I think for me, to be able to forgive means that I believe there will be ultimate justice. And for me, I believe that God is just, that I don't have to exact revenge. I don't have to have revenge on those people who burnt our synagogue. I don't have to have revenge on the people who pushed my parents into the gas truck. I surrender that to God, who is just. It doesn't mean I deny what happened. What happened was evil. It was the darkest evil. And I think this is a question that confronts most of us today. I mean, there is evil in the world today. How do we deal with it? For me, I feel so grateful. I feel as though my life has been given back to me because I was able to trust that God would be in control of the ultimate justice. And I also was aware of all the wrongs within me that I have been forgiven of, and that I've been given this gift of forgiveness. The freedom began with a change in my heart. My early days and my youthful days were very much engaged with battling the demons within. And so I think freedom starts with an inner peace. And so where do we get that peace? And we can look for the peace in escape or engagement with different things. But the big question about freedom is the freedom of the heart. And I think it's only when there are people who are free internally that can, actually we're talking, even when we talk about freedom, about love. How do we love one another? I mean, that is something we all agree on, isn't it? That really, the golden rule, the message to love one another. But how do we have the capacity to do that? I think freedom begins with dealing with our own inner demons. And I feel like my story is a warning. And what would I say to young people? Be alert. Be aware of what's going on. Look beyond, like, when I was a child, I just looked at my little narrow life experience and I say, look outside, see what is happening around. And I want to tell you that my life, I offer my story to say, help is available. Young people today bear heavy burdens, many challenges, but my story is a story of hope, and I want to give you hope.